Welcome to this week's episode of Beyond the Indus. I'm Joe Wallen.
And I'm Tushar Shetty.
And you join us at a pretty illustrious time for the podcast. So me and Tushar actually met up, was last week, for the first time in person since January. We were both in Goa at the same time. So yeah, 40 times to the podcast, Tushar. It was great to see you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was even more delighted that, after the incessant monsoons in Bombay, for some reason, my arrival in Goa heralded 3 days of uninterrupted sun, which just confirms I have holy powers, Joe.
Indeed, it was a pretty great couple of days, and we're back to the rains again now. But yes, it was lovely, and yeah, both back to work this week. But nice to have a bit of a break with the monsoon. And there's always lots going on in the news this week. I mean, I think me and Tushar discussed before the podcast that we were going to hold out and do a bit of an India election special or a bit of a curtain raiser for next week's episode. I mean, there's the big news today is that a plethora of India's largest opposition parties, from Congress, AP to the CMC, meeting in Bangalore with a view to setting up an opposition coalition to challenge the BJP. But we wanted to do this topic justice. We wanted to look at the UCC as well. So we're going to hold for that for next episode. And what have you been following this week, Tushar?
So, Joe, I'm sure you have been following. We recently have attempted another moonshot. So I've been watching these live feeds of Chandrayaan-3, the Moon Mission 3. As you might know, the last moon mission, which I believe happened in 2019, didn't go as well. And I've been reading reports that there was some pressure on the ISRO, that's the Indian Space Research Organization, or officials, to try and get it up sooner than they were ready, which ended, unfortunately, in a crash landing on the moon. But I believe this one's going to be more successful. They've had a lot more tests. They've certainly, invested their time into it. And I think, Joe, for the first time, there seems to be a nationwide excitement or enthusiasm, which possibly existed before, but it was a lot more visible this time around. Were you following the news about that?
Yeah, it's really exciting. But if I had some friends visiting from the UK on the day of the launch, and they said that there was a live viewing party in the lobby of their hotel in Mumbai, which gives an idea of the excitement around the event. But as you say, yes, there was a prior launch in 2019, a soft landing attempted soft landing on the moon's south pole, which was unsuccessful. So this is the second attempt. And I mean, if India is successful, it would become only the fourth country after the former USSR, China, and the US to achieve such a feat. So it is a pretty significant moment in the space race as such. It's no secret that India would like to attract more investment into its space industry. And there's a view that a lot of firms are holding out and looking for this kind of confirmation of quality that this projected landing could provide. It is a really exciting moment. I believe that we should find out by August 24th whether it's been a success or not. So yeah, keep your eyes on that one.
Absolutely. And I think the favorite part that I saw was, or the favorite thing about this was on Twitter, I saw a tweet that said, "Can't wait for British politicians to start asking why we send India so much aid if they can afford moon missions." So this has been a thing. Even the Mars mission, I remember there were some politicians, particularly in the UK, asking why do we send so much in aid to India? But nonetheless, I mean, this is a great achievement for India. And I think definitely a feather in their cap for their global ambitions. But Joe, you've been covering some international stories that have to do with China, haven't you? So what have you been following?
Yes, I mean, the one I think that's gone a bit under the radar over the last week, but I think will have a significant impact, I think, in the years to come. It was the fact that the Dalai Lama was back in the news, not only celebrating his 88th birthday, but this milestone coincided with a meeting with the US Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues, Isra Zaya, who's also the Under Secretary for Civilian Security, Democracy and Human Rights. So the Dalai Lama was in Delhi for this meeting. And now the official line was that the meeting was about preserving Tibetan culture, but unsurprisingly, it attracted ire from neighboring China. The Chinese embassy in New Delhi sent a pretty strongly worded tweet saying that China firmly opposes any form of contact between foreign officials, describing the Dalai Lama as a Tibetan independence force, and was, who'd long been engaging in anti-China separatist activities. That seems to be as far as the row went on. But I think it brings the spiritual leader of Buddhism, who's currently exiled in Dharamshala, which is a town in northern India, which also hosts the Tibetan government in exile, back into focus. Now, I think what's significant about the story is that with the Dalai Lama's advancing years, as for Buddhist belief, the current Dalai Lama will be reincarnated after his death, and his successor will be chosen by the Tibetan government in exile in India and senior Tibetan Buddhists. Now, both the US and China are watching this process keenly, and certainly, according to my sources, strongly trying to influence this succession process, depending on who you read. It's no secret that China would like to see the next Dalai Lama appointed, who pro-Tibet, remaining as part of China. There's a lot of rumors or stories that China's going to appoint its own Dalai Lama, while the US would obviously like the opposite to happen, from what we can tell, and would like the next Dalai Lama again to continue the succession of figureheads kind of in exile in India. So I think it's something really to keep an eye on, because there is going to be a big flare-up as and when the new Dalai Lama is appointed. And I think as the current figure continues to increase in age, we're going to see more and more rhetoric around this, more and more debate around this. I was having a conversation with a good friend actually in China, who works as a political analyst there, and they were suggesting that Beijing might put forward some sort of conditions or terms on the new Dalai Lama, that if India doesn't let China appoint its own figurehead, it might do X or Y. Certainly something to keep an eye on that one, and I think we'll see it kind of more commonplace in the news over the upcoming years.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, people don't maybe think about this all the time, but Buddhism is also an interesting area of cultural influence that India might be able to leverage, particularly in East Asia. I mean, apart from China, you have considerable number of Buddhists in Japan, South Korea, Thailand, a lot of Southeast Asian nations. And it would be interesting to see if the succession crisis sort of drew a line between the ostensibly Buddhist world, and be interesting to see if India used that in conjunction with its Act East policy, to develop its relations with its Asian neighbors. We've seen already some degree of ramp up or indications of ramp up between ties between India and Taiwan. Taiwan opening its first, de facto consulate in Bombay a couple of weeks ago, or at least announcing that they would a couple of weeks ago. So definitely something to watch. But speaking of more domestic issues, Joe, you mentioned the opposition unity rally or meeting that's happening right now in Bangalore. And I thought it'd be an interesting way to dive into one of the topics about Indian democracy that I think is underappreciated to a lot of non-Indian listeners. So one of the weirdest things, Joe, that hit me when I was traveling to Goa is how diverse India actually is, that when you move to the state right across from you, or the neighboring state, you're confronted with a completely different language and script sometimes. I mean, if I move north in the state of Gujarat or south to the state of Karnataka, at some point when I'm driving down the highway, I can't understand the signs or even the people anymore. So you can still find people who understand English or Hindi across the nation, as you know, but it's a lot like when you're traveling in Europe. You can find people, but it's not guaranteed. And the thing is, I thought it would be fascinating to understand why federalism in India is important for its democracy, so that our listeners can contextualize what's happening with Modi and his central government and its ostensible authoritarianism in a broader Indian context. So, as you might know, India is divided into 28 states. We used to have 29, but we kind of lost Kashmir in 2019. It was divided into union territories. And the union territories, which are smaller states that are sort of administered centrally from Delhi. And unlike states in other democracies, because Indian states are extraordinarily diverse, they're also extremely important, because some states like Maharashtra, my home state, is home to more than 120 million people. And it's not even the largest state in India. So the reason why these states are so vital to Indian democracy, firstly, is because the power of the government is shared between the central government and the states. Several key areas like education, policing, and public health are controlled and administered by state governments. So to implement any major policy in India, you're going to have to get the consent and cooperation of state governments. Secondly, even the central legislature, while the lower house is elected in the general elections, the parliamentary elections, much like UK and Canada, for instance, the upper house, the delegates are chosen by state representatives. So even to pass legislation, you kind of need to bring a good chunk of the states and the parties there on board. This gives rise to something I believe is unique to Indian democracy, which is the advent of regional parties. Now, regional parties are essentially political parties that are concentrated largely to one state, and they usually have appeal amongst a specific caste or cultural vote bank. Even if these parties can form a government in the state on their own, they're sometimes quite indispensable to form governments in the center or to form governments in the state. And this is where you see a lot of the problems arising in the way Indian democracy functions, particularly under strong central governments like Modi, like the BJP. So, in order to bring these regional parties on board, central governments have a variety of methods that they use. Some of these are constitutional and seen all over the world. For instance, promising particular ministries or particular portfolios to key members of regional parties in order to elicit their support. But lately, you've been seeing a lot of, let's say, unconstitutional approaches. For instance, the position of governor, which is a ceremonial appointment by the central government to oversee state politics. These governors are supposed to be apolitical, but you see the BJP using their governors to interfere in state politics increasingly. The other way that central government is targeting state and regional parties is by using central agencies like, let's say, the Enforcement Directorate, the CBI, the Narcotics Control Bureau, basically bodies assigned to police corruption, financial transactions, drugs, etc. And you see cases being levied against certain politicians who don't toe the line. So, Joe, in this context, I think the meeting of opposition parties in Bangalore is particularly important because if you can't cobble together a coalition for the general election, it's a lot harder for you to come to power. Now, we know that Mr. Modi's two elections have bucked this trend, and the BJP has come to power alone with the majority. But in his third term, as opposition parties are getting increasingly consolidated and increasingly worried about their own future with an increasingly aggressive BJP, I think this is definitely one to watch. And let's see if this coalition of parties can actually come together to pose a real threat to the BJP in 2024.
It's fascinating stuff, and I think it's something that a lot of our listeners perhaps aren't aware of. And I have to say, very well explained on quite a complicated topic there. It's something that, from where I come from in the UK, originally it's just completely alien to us. Kind of the state system, as you say, and quite the level of power that is devolved. And we've seen kind of quite fierce debates recently between Arvind Kejriwal, who's the chief minister in Delhi, and India's home ministry about who controls the police in Delhi. And it is something that we hear about a lot here, and will continue to do so. Certainly this opposition alliance is, fairly unprecedented in recent times in India. We didn't see it in the last couple of elections, and the prospect of having kind of your Mallikarjun Kharge, Mamata Banerjee, Kejriwal again, I just mentioned, all coming together to take on the BJP. It kind of feels almost a little bit Marvel franchise-esque, but it seems to be, it could be a reality. But as I say, I think we're keen to look into this in a bit more detail next week, because it is, I think it is the issue that's going to define next year's elections, and a really fascinating one. So a brilliant taste of that from Mr. Shetty. Yeah, onwards to the topic this week. This is one that we wanted to look at on the podcast for a while. I think the news cycle in South Asia has been, as always, pretty relentless. But one that I'm certainly very passionate about personally. You cast your minds past 2017, and Myanmar security forces have begun a wave of rape, murder, and arson against the country's Muslim Rohingya minority that is currently being subject to a genocide investigation at the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And is widely seen around the world as being ethnic cleansing. Now, around 1 million Rohingya fled, fearing their lives, to neighbouring Bangladesh, where they still live today in the world's largest refugee camp in Cox's Bazar. Now, Bangladesh's ruling Awami League has been struggling of late when we look at its finances or the economic situation of Bangladesh. Long heralded, or certainly in recent times, as South Asia's major success story, Bangladesh recently approached the IMF for funding. One of many South Asian countries that have struggled in the wake of the COVID pandemic, in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Bangladesh, or the Awami League, certainly has viewed hosting the Rohingya as a major inconvenience. And if anything, it has since made their already dire living conditions in Cox's Bazar much, much worse, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months.
So as per the Human Rights Watch, in 2022, the authorities have made life impossible for the Rohingya in Cox's Bazar, with a series of policies that include closing schools and limiting their movement. And meanwhile, the security situation in the camps continue to deteriorate as armed Rohingya groups, the Bangladesh security forces, and insurgents from Myanmar battle for control. at least 40 Rohingya were killed last year, mainly community leaders. And the number of those killed has already reached 48 this year, although the Rohingya say that it is far higher than this.
So last Thursday, while the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, was on a visit to the camp to collect evidence, 6 Rohingya were killed in a horrific day of fighting. The situation really is desperate and has been compounded by the fact that many international aid agencies, including the World Food Programme, have had to scale back funding for the camp or its residents this year. Now, 5 times as many Rohingya fled from Cox's Bazar in 2022 by boat, desperately trying to reach Malaysia, Indonesia. While negotiations over their repatriation back to Myanmar have gone no further. We hear a lot in the news about migrants and refugees crossing the Mediterranean to Europe, but this is a similar situation, and in many instances, a much more desperate situation happening in the Indian Ocean, but we hear far less about it. A small delegation of Rohingya visited their former homes in May, but appear reluctant to return. That the authorities in Myanmar are refusing to give them citizenship, and it seems that they will be housed in villages and wouldn't be able to leave. So conditions that mirror what they faced in Cox's Bazar for many years now. I thought we were both keen to kind of discuss this as our topic on the podcast this week, because we really feel it's something that's fallen from the news headlines and deserves a lot more coverage and a lot more awareness. And with that instance, we'd be keen to introduce our first guest to the podcast this week, who'd like to remain anonymous. They're a leading Rohingya activist based in Cox's Bazar, who've been living in the camp for many years. It's incredibly rare to have direct insight from inside Cox's Bazar. Communications are very, very difficult. There's a crackdown on those that do speak to the media. So to have someone to speak about what day-to-day life is like there, it's very moving and powerful. But we felt it was necessary to really get across the gravity of the situation.
Thank you for doing this interview with Beyond the Indus. So you've requested to have your name withheld because of the obvious security risks you face, but I think I can describe you as someone from the Rohingya community, an activist fighting for better conditions and more awareness about the plight of your people. And you're presently living in the world's largest refugee camp in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. Could you start by maybe describing the situation there right now? What are the conditions like? We've been hearing reports of criminal organizations increasing their activity in the camps. Are these reports true?
Actually, the clash between the criminal organization has claimed the life of innocent refugees since the situation in the camp has gotten so bad. The number of killing, kidnapping, and blackmailing has already risen. Even within the barbed wire enclosed refugee camp, the Rohingya are subject to such a stringent restriction on movement. No one can move anywhere since they are all trapped in a terrible scenario for fear of being killed, abducted, or robbed by the thugs. Also, the WFP's food costs cause the majority of refugees to eat poorly balanced meals. At the same time, malnutrition and its repercussions from communicable disease are particularly problematic for refugees and the elderly people. Another big issue that refugee children is facing is the lack of access to high quality education.
So you've mentioned a few things: increase in the criminal activity, violence, malnutrition, kids being deprived of basic facilities. And I guess my question is, have things always been this bad in the camps, or has the situation deteriorated considerably in the past few years? And what's caused this deterioration and this uptick in violence?
Refugee life is not easy. Most of the time we faced unbearable, agony in our life. Since we are refugees, some of the things has been so bad since the last 4 or 5 years. Of them, to say a few, WFP food assistance has been substantially decreased twice within 3 months, causing refugees to find other means of supporting themselves. While this is ongoing, certain, miscreants inside and outside the camp attempting to take advantage of the helpless Rohingya refugees youth for their own political benefit and power in the camp by paying them some money, which result in the killings of innocent people.
So there are increasing reports of Rohingya refugees choosing to flee the camps in Cox's Bazar. Some of them attempting to return home to Myanmar, despite the ongoing violence there. Others that are trying to flee to different countries. This is increasingly making them targets for human traffickers. So could you explain why Rohingya people at this point are choosing to flee Bangladesh and the camps there? And how are human traffickers taking advantage of this?
When the Rohingya refugee camp turned into a literal hell for them due to the extremely dangerous and deteriorating condition here, so they made the decision to leave and risk their lives in any possible way. Many refugees become vulnerable in the camp due to the excessive suffering, poverty, and unpredictability of their futures to go back home to Myanmar, which make them easy prey for human trafficker. Truthfully, there are a lot of human traffickers in the camp and in Myanmar who persuade the refugees by giving false promises. And while traveling to Malaysia and like Indonesia, the trafficker harass them, especially girls, and hold them hostage for an exorbitant ransom.
The Rohingya crisis has endured for several years now, and it doesn't seem like things are going to improve anytime soon, especially with the military junta government in Myanmar right now. For my final question, as a representative of the Rohingya people, what message do you have for the international community? We have listeners from all over the world. Tell us, what can the international community do to help ease the suffering of the Rohingya people?
The international community must not forget our genocide survivors. They should provide humanitarian support for the Rohingya refugees as long as we can go back to our country with nationality, safety, and security. Too much has been suffered by our people for just the citizenship right. Honestly speaking, my father and forefather died with the hope of holding citizenship right in their hands. Now it's me and my children hoping that for the same thing, suffering the same tragedies. All in all, I don't want my children suffer this thing in their life. It's clear that the military junta will never take the Rohingya back from Bangladesh by giving their nationality, their citizenship right back. And the military will just kill the Rohingya people in the way they have been doing for long decades if they can take even a single Rohingya back from Bangladesh without sufficient security and national citizenship right. So that to save the Rohingya people from suffering another genocide in their lives, the most powerful countries in the world, like the United States, India, China, and the EU countries, must play a major role. Give the military a strong pressure to restore our citizenship right back as early as possible. It's now been 6 years in the camp, but it's too long for us. How many more years do we have to wait for our identity? How many more people have to be died in the sea to get our identity? After all, it's time to find a sustainable solution for the Rohingya crisis. And youth like us should be given the opportunity to study higher education to be able to become professional so that we can liberate our country with our people.
So now to welcome our second guest to the podcast, Matthew Smith. Matthew is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Fortify Rights, one of the world's leading human rights organizations, which regularly collaborates with the United Nations and governments around the world, and has been active in Myanmar since 2013. A Harvard fellow, Matthew's work has exposed genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, multi-billion-dollar corruption, and other human rights violations, to name but a few. Welcome to the podcast, Matthew, and how are you?
Thank you so much, Joe. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
So Matthew, just before we begin, maybe it's a good idea to give our listeners an idea about what the Rohingya refugee crisis is all about. You know, having stayed in Europe for the past few years, you hear a lot more about, say, the crises in Syria or the Middle Eastern refugee crises, but a lot of people don't have an idea about this almost genocide going on in the other part of the world. So maybe just to start with, could you give our listeners a brief overview about what the Rohingya crisis is all about and how it started?
Sure. This is an ethnic and religious minority from Myanmar, and they've been experiencing persecution from the Myanmar military and successive governments in Myanmar for decades. The persecution of the Rohingya increased significantly in 2016 and 2017 with in response to attacks by some Rohingya militants against the Myanmar authorities. The Myanmar military responded with massive, disproportionate violence and essentially burned down hundreds of villages, raped, killed, tortured, disappeared Rohingya en masse, and essentially forced upwards of 1 million Rohingya to flee into Bangladesh. And there were already anywhere between 250,000 to 500,000 Rohingya already living in squalid camps in Bangladesh's Cox's Bazar district. And then with that outflow of refugees in 2016 and 2017, the situation, the camp has become, of course, a much bigger phenomenon.
This crisis has been going on for several years now. But last year, we saw the number of Rohingya fleeing away from Cox's Bazar by boat increasing by fivefold. What do you think this is driving this exodus? How have conditions in Cox's Bazar deteriorated? And why has funding from some NGOs like the WFP been reduced?
Yeah, this is a situation that has been occurring annually. What is sometimes referred to as the quote unquote sailing season. There are transnational criminal syndicates, human trafficking syndicates that have been operational in the camps in Myanmar, as well as in the camps of Bangladesh, as well as in Myanmar and in other countries within ASEAN, and in some cases colluding with the authorities in various places. Even going back to 2012 to 2015, we had documented the trafficking of upwards of 170,000 Rohingya from Bangladesh and from Myanmar to Thailand and Malaysia. They were subjected to heinous crimes, mass atrocity crimes, in fact, international crimes. But part of what still drives this, there are a few reasons. Part of what still drives the exodus, the annual exodus, is a lack of accountability on these criminal syndicates that are essentially trafficking Rohingya, deceiving them to get to board boats and then holding them for ransom and committing crimes against them. But beyond that, many Rohingya just see no future in Bangladesh. They're essentially trapped in these camps. They're denied the possibility of returning to Myanmar in any sort of safe or dignified fashion. And beyond that, Rohingya are denied. The Bangladesh authorities still deny the Rohingya the right to work, so they can't earn a livelihood. They're dependent on handouts from humanitarian organizations, and as you alluded to, those handouts are decreasing significantly. So there's a food crisis right now happening in the camps, and the World Food Program has been forced to cut food rations significantly, and so now you have an entire population of people that are dealing with things like malnourishment on a much bigger scale. And so all of these things combined with, the denial of freedom of movement, as well as the increased activity of Rohingya militants in the camps that are making life miserable for Rohingya, committing killings, disappearances, torture, and other types of violations with impunity. So when you combine all of these aspects of what the Rohingya are surviving or attempting to survive in Bangladesh, sadly, it's no surprise that people would be attempting to flee.
We just spoke to a Rohingya activist in Cox's Bazar who wanted to be unnamed, and he specifically mentioned and pointing to the worsening security situation in the camps. More Rohingya have been killed in the first 6 months of this year than the whole of 2022. So maybe you could talk about these Rohingya militants in the camps, or what is driving this violence, and who's behind it?
Yeah, there's an unfortunate phenomenon that's been observed through history, arguably, of victims crimes or of persecution mirroring the behavior of their perpetrators. And unfortunately, this is the type of scenario we're seeing unfold in the camps. There are several Rohingya-led militant groups. The Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army is the largest of these groups, and they purport to be fighting for Rohingya freedom, but in reality, they're committing very serious human rights violations against their own people in the camps. We're documenting killings, we're documenting torture, we're documenting threats and harassment. They're particularly vicious with regard to young women young Rohingya women who exercise their right to freedom of expression or want to work for humanitarian organizations, for example. So these are groups that are wreaking havoc. They're a menace to Rohingya society in the camps. And unfortunately, the Bangladesh authorities have not done nearly enough to provide a secure and safe place for Rohingya in the camps. And I should say too, this is sadly, this has been part and parcel to Bangladesh strategy, if you will, over many years. There are even Bangladesh officials going on record many years ago talking about how they should not be making the situation too comfortable for Rohingya because they don't want them to stay in Bangladesh. And so from our perspective, this is part of that really perverse, inhumane strategy of failing to protect the Rohingya refugee population.
Conditions certainly seem to have really deteriorated over the past year. I mean, something that during my time at the Telegraph, we reported on or attempted to report on quite extensively, and something that really concerned me, I think, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months, were increasing limits on movements for those in the camps. Activists would regularly tell me that heavily pregnant women or unwell children were being able to access healthcare. It was very difficult for them to move around to reach centres where they could get the care they needed. It really is multifaceted when we come to the challenges that the Rohingya face in Cox's Bazar. And now in March, a Rohingya delegation was allowed to visit Myanmar as part of the bilateral discussions between Myanmar and Bangladesh over the return or potential return of the community. Now, most of the Rohingya community seem opposed to what was offered or found on the visit. The model villages weren't hospitable. They were told they wouldn't be given full citizenship in Myanmar. The UN has repeatedly said the conditions in Myanmar are not right or not ready for their repatriation. I mean, what are the conditions like today for members of the Rohingya community that remain in Myanmar? And do you think the repatriation of the community is likely to happen anytime soon?
Unfortunately, we don't see repatriation happening anytime soon. And part of the reason for that is that the same military that led and orchestrated the genocidal attacks on the Rohingya in 2016 and 2017, this is the same military that attempted to take control of the entire country through its bloody coup d'etat on February 1st, 2021. So this is a military that at present, as we speak, is carrying out a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population throughout the entire country. This includes against Rohingya. It includes against the ethnic Rakhine or Arakanese population in Rakhine State. And so that, of course, makes any prospect for safe, dignified, and voluntary return, which are the elements of reasonable returns for refugees in these situations. It makes that impossible. But beyond that, Rohingya and Rakhine State right now are still dealing with some of the same violations they've been dealing with for many years. They're denied freedom of movement. They're effectively confined to their villages in Rakhine State. They're still denied access to citizenship rights. They're still facing violence as a matter of daily survival. The National Unity Government of Myanmar, which of course formed after the coup in opposition to the coup, and this is a government comprising elected officials and others that have an interest in of course, bringing democracy to Myanmar. They're in many ways leading the revolution that's ongoing in the country. they have done an about face with regard to their Rohingya policy, which has been very inspiring. The National Unity Government has committed itself to ensuring justice and accountability for the Rohingya people. It has committed itself to ensuring citizenship for Rohingya people. But the as of right now, those commitments are very important. But as of right now, there still is essentially this nationwide attack that the Myanmar military is carrying out. There's armed conflict happening. The Arakan Army is a non-state armed group, an ethnic armed group, ethnic army, essentially fighting the revolution in Myanmar. And the war between the Arakan Army and the Myanmar military often wreaks havoc on the civilian population. And so this includes the Rohingya population. This includes the ethnic Rakhine and some of the other smaller ethnic groups that call Rakhine State their home. So overall, the conditions, unfortunately, are really not ripe for this. I will just add, though, that the Myanmar military is really intent on attempting to return Rohingya to Myanmar because of an ongoing case at the International Court of Justice. There's a genocide trial that the military junta is facing in The Hague right now, and part of what they want to do is demonstrate to the court that they have an interest in protecting the Rohingya right to return. It's a farce, and certainly we don't have any expectation that the judges at the International Court of Justice will in any way look favorably upon that scenario.
That brings me on to my next question, which is that last week, the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, visited Cox's Bazar to collect evidence in the case that you mentioned. And Mr. Khan has said that we must, he gave quite a strongly worded statement after his visit saying we must not forget the Rohingya. I think as we mentioned previously on the podcast, there were 6 Rohingya killed on the same day that he visited. I think Mr. Khan saw conditions, also the conditions kind of very upfront. But given that the ICC's investigations into genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity involving the Rohingya was ordered back in 2019, why has it taken so long for the ICC to collect evidence? And could you give us a bit of an overview of other cases against the Myanmar military?
The wheels of international justice move tremendously slow. We know that. And we all have an interest, including those working at the International Criminal Court. We all have an interest in those wheels speeding up, and we have an interest in international justice becoming more efficient. The ICC is an indispensable institution in our world, but it is moving incredibly slow with regard to this. Technically, the ICC is not actually investigating genocide in Myanmar, and that's one of the political hurdles that I think must be overcome. The court, back in 2019, the court basically obtained jurisdiction to investigate and possibly prosecute forced deportation, specifically as a crime against humanity. Part of the reason for that is, Myanmar is not a state party to the ICC, but Bangladesh is. And forced deportation is a crime that necessarily involves 2 countries. So in short, that's basically how the court obtained jurisdiction to investigate atrocity crimes against the Rohingya via Bangladesh, because Bangladesh is a state party to the court. The National Unity Government of Myanmar did issue what's known as a 12.3 declaration. And what this was highly significant. And what this actually means is that the National Unity Government, which of course, again, is in opposition to the Myanmar military's illegal criminal regime, they've essentially ceded jurisdiction to the court to investigate and prosecute mass atrocity crimes, any manner of mass atrocity crimes occurring in Myanmar over the course of many years. So the onus right now is really on the prosecutor at the ICC to pick up that 12.3 declaration and launch a full investigation. And he's not doing that right now. And so member states, state parties to the International Criminal Court really should contact the prosecutor, refer the situation in Myanmar to the prosecutor, that is essentially how the investigation in Ukraine launched. And there's a similar dynamic at play. And we're not seeing the same level of attention to the atrocities happening in Myanmar as we are in these other scenarios. So, yeah, so that's essentially the situation, at least as we see it.
And I wanted to mention the Basan Char, which is, I'd better describe it as a sort of a low-lying silt island in the Bay of Bengal, a part of the world which is prone to cyclones and adverse weather. One that I'm rather nervous to be flying over next week in the middle of the monsoon. And it's been called Prison Island by Human Rights Watch. Thousands of the Rohingya have been resettled also to Basan Char, and this has been heavily criticised, saying that not only is the island itself unsuitable for human habitation, but conditions or infrastructure that's been built there is unsuitable. That we've seen families split up, so mothers, fathers, children. Some in Cox's Bazar, some taken to Basan Char. This is a very contentious policy from the Bangladeshi authorities. I mean, what are the concerns about living conditions there? And are Rohingya being forced to relocate to this island by the Bangladeshi authorities?
Yeah, thanks for that. We have, at Fortify Rights, we have documented coercive practices around Bangladesh authorities relocating Rohingya refugees from the mainland camps to the island. The situation has evolved over time. That it's still problematic for a number of reasons. For example, there's no formal appeal process if a person on Basan Char wants to leave the island once they arrive. And this, of course, makes their stay on Basan Char not voluntary. And so it also makes Rohingya feel like they're effectively detained on the island with no ability to go back formally with the permission from the authorities. So there is the ability for Rohingya on Basan Char to go and visit the mainland camp. This was a change, a welcomed change that came some time ago. Generally, they can visit for 2 to 3 weeks, but approvals take time. Some Rohingya that we've spoken with have been attempting to get approval to go back to the mainland camps to visit with their families and with their communities. And they've been waiting for months and months on end for that approval. It's also worth mentioning that this is not freedom of movement. Freedom of movement is freedom of movement. And when you have to seek approval from the state for, a visit to another part of the camps that would effectively only last a couple of weeks, this is, of course, not what we mean when we talk about the human right to freedom of movement, which, of course, does extend to refugees as well. We have documented cases of also people Rohingya who are on the islands, or who are on Basan Char Island rather, and who have been arrested for attempting to leave the island. And so these are the types of things that are taking place there. It's also worth mentioning, I think, that delivering humanitarian services on Basan Char is very expensive for humanitarian groups. And so, in this context of pretty drastic food cuts that the World Food Program has made, due, as they say, to a lack of funding, to be spending, larger amounts of resources to deliver services on Basan Char, really doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. But the fact of the matter remains that the island is there now. There are Rohingya there. But there are a lot of things that the Bangladesh authorities can and should do to not only protect Rohingya from violence, but also to respect their rights as refugees. These camps, whether it's Basan Char, whether it's the mainland camps, are really not the future for the Rohingya people. This is a group of people, a population of people that's been persecuted for far too long. And they deserve rights. They deserve to have a future where they can access education, where they can access livelihood, and exercise their rights. And unfortunately, right now, the conditions are not conducive to any of that.
So, Matthew, as our final question, what possible solutions are there for the Rohingya? Is it possible that do you foresee a return to Myanmar? for them? Can the authorities be pressured or convinced to facilitate that? And what do you think is likely to happen in the interim?
Several years ago, we collected some data. We did a participatory action research project with a team of brilliant Rohingya researchers in the camps who collected data. They designed the questions, they collected data. And we released it in a report called "Torture in My Mind." And one of the data points in that survey that the Rohingya conducted in their own community had to do with Rohingya refugees' desire to return home to Myanmar, to their indigenous homeland in Myanmar. And unsurprisingly, the vast majority of Rohingya expressed a desire to return home. And so I think in the long term, that is the ultimate solution. The Rohingya have a right to return home. They should have a right to do so safely and in a dignified and voluntary fashion. And so, it's anybody's guess as to when the situation in Myanmar will be conducive to that. It's of course not the case right now, but I think that's a big part of the longer term answer for the Rohingya people. I think there are a lot of different pieces to this puzzle. Accountability for mass atrocity crimes is one of them. So long as the generals in Myanmar and their henchmen are, essentially roaming free, the risk of more genocidal attacks is ever present. And so more resources have to be put into holding the perpetrators of these crimes accountable. Governments need to do more to support that. But there's unfortunately, given the vast scale of violations that the community is facing, there's no silver bullet, unfortunately. So there does have to be more attention to the plight of the Rohingya from various governments. And I will say too, the Rohingya civil society has been extraordinary throughout all of this. We're working regularly with Rohingya human rights defenders who are, whether they're in Myanmar, whether they're in Bangladesh, or whether they're part of the diaspora, they're working day and night to achieve justice and accountability and a more rights-respecting future for their community. And so we would encourage, whether it's donors or other human rights groups or others to do whatever they can to support Rohingya civil society. They will be an indispensable part of a more rights-respecting future for the Rohingya people.
So, Joe, I think out of all the issues that we've covered, this one's one of the more tragic ones, for me at least. I think when the activist in Cox's Bazar talked about how his grandfather and father struggled all their life in this issue, and all he wants is for his kids not to have to go through that same experience, it does fill me with a sense of hopelessness, because what options are there for them? Our guest Matthew did talk about some of the more legal options out there with the ICC, but I'm not sure how effective those are going to be, especially with the current regime in Myanmar. But what impressions did you have, Joe? Did you think that there's a viable solution out there for the Rohingya in the future?
It really is a horrific situation. Unfortunately, we look at things from the Bangladeshi side. We've got a general election coming up in January, which the incumbent Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, is coming under increasing pressure at the moment. There were large protests today by Bangladesh's biggest opposition party, the BNP. We've seen a major crackdown, thousands and thousands, about 20,000 politicians and supporters being abducted or arrested or charged in recent months. We've seen opposition journalists and activists being arrested, which gives you an idea about how, I think, panicked the Hasina government is ahead of that election. They've been struggling to manage the country's economy. As I mentioned, they've gone to the IMF. There are kind of increasing allegations of corruption against the Hasina government. I think very sadly for the Rohingya, we're looking ahead. Certainly for the government at the moment, there are other priorities. And one would think that if Hasina and the party the Awami League are re-elected in January, they'd look to strengthen their hold on power rather than addressing the Rohingya crisis immediately. And likewise, if the BNP were to, I think surprisingly, given the level of crackdown they faced in recent months and come back to power again, they would have other priorities. So I think certainly for me, this horrible situation is not one that's going to kind of conclude or resolve soon, certainly in the run-up to the election in Bangladesh at least.
Yeah, and I think placing it in a broader geopolitical context, I do feel that, as Matthew mentioned, there's not much attention being given to the Rohingya issue. In fact, there's no one really batting for them. A lot of governments in the West that would normally support these issues, for them, it's too far away, and the powers in the region are not going to help out. I don't think India is doing anything for the Rohingya. And China doesn't seem to be in any rush to pressure Myanmar to do anything about that situation. So I think what's important at this point is, as Matthew said, to get the word out, to raise awareness in the West, in the global development community. And as long as we have more and more people batting for them, hopefully there might be more pressure from international sources, both in Bangladesh as well as Myanmar, to treat these people a little better. We've seen recently with the Bangladesh election coming up, I've heard from my sources in Dhaka that there's some pressure from the United States to go ahead with a free and fair election. I'm not sure how effective that's going to be, but perhaps there can be some hope if powers like the US or the EU continue putting pressure on both governments to find a long-term sustainable solution for the Rohingya crisis.
Yes, just to add quickly on that. Yes, the Washington's announced that it will impose visa bans or restrictions on members of the Bangladeshi regime that are seen to be part of this crackdown on opposition parties, which is quite a hardline approach, you'd think, from the US with increasing Chinese influence in Bangladesh. And Washington's quite cautious about pushing Dhaka any closer to Beijing. So it's quite a strong policy there, I think, from the US, really. But yeah, I mean, that's unfortunately all we've got time for this week, or on this week's episode of Beyond the Indus. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in, and as always, thank you to our guests this week. And we look forward to having you on board in a fortnight's time.
Stay safe and bye.